Welcome to Intro to Canadian National Debate Format, otherwise known as CNDF. During this presentation, we'll be going over the basics of this format and how to do well in it. So, a debate in CNDF is a defense of arguments for or against a motion. The motion is just another word for a topic that is given to you within a set rules. So within CNDF, there are teams of 2 speakers. There are 2 teams of 2 speakers each, and they are given 15 minutes of preparation time, during which no research on the given topic or motion is permitted, so no use of Googling, ChatGPT, asking other people, etc. There are also prepared versions in which you're allowed to research and prepare a case, so you should be aware which type of debate you are doing before engaging in it. So there are a couple motion types within the Canadian national debate format. The first and most common of which are analysis motions. So you can see that now motions all start with TH, which is just short for this house, which refers to kind of society at large, unless it's otherwise specified to be a more specific group of people or even a particular individual. So analysis motions include this house believes that, this house supports, this house opposes, and this house prefers. In an analysis motion, you are to argue about whether a thing is good or bad. So if the motion is this house supports the rise of TikTok, you would talk about whether TikTok is good or bad for society, depending on what side of the bench you are on, so whether you are for or against the motion. In order to create your arguments, you should consider who are the parties involved or impacted by this motion, how is society affected, and some minority groups that could be particularly benefited or harmed by the motion. So for like this house supports TikTok, maybe the minority group you should think about the most are children, and you should justify why children are most impacted by this motion, whether they would be harmed or benefit from something like this in order to win your round. The second type of motions are policy motions. So for example, this house would. In a policy motion, you're to argue about the likelihood that a policy can be implemented and whether the result is good or bad. So policy motion adds an additional layer of analysis, so not just if the thing is good or bad, but whether or not it is likely to be implemented. So in order to create arguments for policy motions, you should also consider who would be for or against the policy, along with who are affected, whether society becomes better or worse off if the policy is implemented, and whether or not the policy is an efficient allocation of resources, or if the issue that the policy addresses can be better dealt with other methods. So for example, this house would construct low-income housing. You could consider who would be for or against the policy, who would be for or against the construction of low-income housing. So maybe existing property owners would think that their property value will go down and therefore they'll be very opposed. Or people who require low-income housing would definitely be for this policy. And you can talk about how much political power each of these groups have, and in order to justify why this policy would or would not be implemented. So this is the speaking order for CNDF. The first speaker is called first proposition, and then you would go to first opposition. Next is second proposition, followed by second opposition. And this is the core of the content. And then in order to conclude the debate, first you will have the opposition reply speech, followed by the government reply speech. So now I'll just briefly go over each of the speaking roles and kind of what you're expected to do within your speech. So the first proposition should ensure that the debate is adequately defined and lay out their team's approach and case line and advance arguments in support of the motion. The first opposition would refute arguments made by the proposition side and advance their own case lines and arguments against the motion. This will be followed by the second proposition and the second opposition, who do more or less the same thing. You would be refuting whichever speaker went ahead of you, and then rebuild your partner's case by providing new analysis as to why the things that your partner said are still important or still stands within the round despite any refutation that was done against it. And this is optional, but you can also advance one new argument if time allows for it or you have really good arguments to advance. Right. And lastly are the reply speeches, in which no new arguments can be made. If you are to make a new argument, your judge within the round will kind of disregard it and pretend you never said it. But new analysis is also okay. This means providing new reasons why your partner's arguments that they already brought up, so they're not new, still stands within the round or are more important than your opponent's. So in the reply speech, you should explain why your team is winning. And in order to do this, you should refute the other side and rebuild your partner. So if you heard our intro to BP seminar, we bring up the analogy of Jenga towers. So by providing analysis and rebuilding your partner, you're making your own tower taller, and by refuting the opposition or like your opponents, and then refuting them, that knocks down their tower, and you're trying to have the tallest tower at the end. You could also weigh, which just pointing out that your tower is taller than theirs by explaining why your arguments are the most important. Right. And moving on to points of information. So a POI is a formal interjection within the round made during the other side's speech. So common POIs are to poke holes in whoever's speaking's arguments. So while they're speaking, you should be taking notes and trying to formulate a POI that will be really detrimental to their case. So common POIs include, why is this true given whatever reason, or pointing out a context in which their argument does not work. But you have to remember that the time is the speaker's. So if you're speaking, you can choose not to take POIs and you can choose when to take POIs. You're not obligated to take every single thing that's given to you. You would give a POI by saying the word POI or like raising your hand or standing up. The speaker, before they start their speech, can tell the room their POI preference. So for example, I don't really like it when people interrupt my speech with words, so I prefer it if you just raise your hand. POIs are not permitted in the first or last minute of the speech or at any time during the reply speeches, so you should make sure to time whoever is speaking so that you give the POI at an appropriate time. There's no obligation to take POIs, but we like engagement in the debate, which just means engaging with your opponents. So it is common practice or like courtesy to give a POI and take at least one POI. So how do you win a round of CNDF? Both teams are trying to prove that their side is right, and the team that does the best job of proving their side wins the debate. In the BP seminar, we also talked about kind of the axis of truth and importance. So you want to formulate an argument that is both true and important. And if your opponent's argument, and you can point out that your argument's more true, more important than your opponent. So judging criteria in CNDF is a little different from in BP. So this is an order of importance. And first, and the most important criteria in judging is content. So how analytically sound is what you say? Do you prove that the things you claim are true? The second most important is strategy, where like how important is what you say? And you should, in your speech, give reasons as to why what you're saying is the most important in order to win on this criteria. And lastly, the least important thing to consider after if you're like tied on both is style. So how well presented is the thing you say, but that's only after content strategy. So make sure you are focusing on those two. But if two teams have equally analytically sound content and equally important strategy, then the tie would be broken on how stylish your speech is or how persuasive you were able to be. Right. If you have questions, feel free to stay in touch and ask them to the Hart House Outreach email, and have fun debating in CNDF.